half a century ago, when I was a teenager. I wanted to learn how to develop black and white cine films, so I came here to the River Wansbeck. I bought all the equipment and chemicals needed for the process, but then I needed a film to develop. My dad had a boat and shed on the north bank of the river, so going with him on a fishing trip gave me an easy subject to film. It had a logical beginning and an end, and plenty of movement and activities in between. Rediscovering that old and forgotten film in my loft 50 years later was like coming across a piece of treasure, because in the process of making it, I inadvertently caught a moment in time and a slice of life that vanished shortly after it was captured on my old clockwork cine camera. In those days, Camas Pit Heap lowered over the south bank of the River Wansbeck, opposite to the line of old boat sheds that included my dad's. Behind the sheds, on the north bank, was a steep slope of red ash. The ash was more industrial slag that had been dumped there for many decades. Peppered over the lunar landscape that it formed were jagged boulders of purple clinker and banks of loose shale. A winding pathway led through the shale down to the riverside, and the boathouses where fishermen repaired their crab pots and baited lines as they waited for the tide to turn. Because the Wansbeck was tidal in those days, experienced fishermen knew that if they waited for the tide to be either as high or as low as it was going to get that day, there was a spell of slack water, which would make it easier for them to leave the river and get out to sea. At low tide, the water outside the boathouses was too shallow for the boat's outboard motor to be used, so it had to be manhandled into deeper water further downriver. Even the extra weight of my cousin Mick would have had the boat stuck in the mud, so he ran further along the shore to a rendezvous point opposite the deeper water, where he could be picked up for the journey out to sea. Today, a road bridge carries the A189 spine road over the Wansbeck, but for many years an old iron bridge stood close to the same spot. That bridge carried coal tubs hauled by a continuous pulley system between North Seaton Colliery and Camas until the pit closed and the bridge was no longer needed. It was demolished around 1962. But when this film was made 3 years later, the concrete footings that once supported the old bridge were still there. At the river mouth, the current was still too much for the little boat's outboard motor, so my dad, my cousin Mick, who had joined us for the journey, and myself had to haul the boat by hand over the shoals into deeper seawater. Once the fishing ground had been reached, the first job was to throw a floating flag known as a dam into the sea. One end of a line of baited hooks was attached to the dam, and as the boat was rowed away, the line was fed out with care and skill to avoid tangles and hooks in fingers. Once the full line had been fed out, a second dan, marking the other end of it, was thrown into the sea as well. The line, hopefully full of fish, would be brought back in the next day. In the meantime, a line of pots, which had been dropped onto the seabed a couple of days earlier, had to be retrieved. The dan at one end of the line was brought on board first. Then the rope was hauled in until the first crab pot surfaced. This was brought on board, and after its catch was removed, a lump of fresh bait was tied inside the pot before the next one was hauled in. Once all the pots were hauled on board and rebaited, they were taken to a new spot and thrown, one at a time, back into the sea. It had been a long, hard shift, so when Dad's friends Eddie Cook and Norman Davidson, with Eddie's younger nephew John Lum, came past in their bigger boat and offered to tow us back to harbour, the invitation was readily accepted. On the way back, we passed dozens of boats and boathouses of all shapes and sizes. They had been there for generations, but were soon to vanish. Within 10 years, a weir was built close to the site of the old Tub Bridge. It held the river permanently at full tide, helping to turn a once tatty waterway into an attractive riverside park. But that work also called for the boathouses to be got rid of. The river was at high tide when we returned, and after climbing back on board the little boat, it was rowed the short distance back to the harbour and the little boathouse that my dad and his brother John had built from stones salvaged from the remains of a demolished pub that had once stood at the river mouth. This watercolour painting by Ashington artist Mary Preston shows the old pub where it stood, close to a chain ferry run by a man called Wheatley. Today, the pub, the boathouses, the boats, Wheatley's ferry, even the red ash heap and purple boulders have all vanished. So has the old village of North Seaton Colliery, which was also demolished in the 1960s. But some evidence of those old days does still remain at the water's edge. Even the occasional and very distinctive yellow house brick made by Ashington Coal Company can still be found. These bricks were used to make many of the colliery buildings in Old North Seaton. Today, the area has been reshaped by a massive landscaping operation which turned the harsh red landscape into a green and pleasant riverside walk, although one where walkers still stroll along paths that are made of red ash.